million records. And we have a staff of 70 to maintain those collections. Our archives and Office of Archives and History headquarters, which includes the State Archives, is based in Raleigh. We have a great location right in between the Governor's Mansion and the State Legislature on Jones Street. We also have 2 regional locations, the Western Regional Archives in Asheville and the Outer Banks History Center in Manio. And all 3 of those locations are open for research 5 days a week, Tuesday through Saturday. And we also have, together with the State Library, a large digital collection, and we post new materials there all the time, and also photographs on our Flickr page and videos on our YouTube page. So hopefully you can visit us at all those locations, both in person and online. We welcome your visits anytime. And then finally, since our audience may be joining from some of our audience is joining from out of state, we're happy to see plenty of you all are from North Carolina, but I wanted to share with you the locations I'm talking about with the State Archives, and also the 2 locations we'll be talking about tonight in conjunction with the book settings: Alamance Battleground near Burlington and Tryon Palace in New Bern, close to the coast. So during this presentation, we invite you to type your questions at any time into the chat or Q&A box. I'll be monitoring those, as will the other panelists. And if there's a quick specific question, we might try to get to that in between presentations, but in the interest of time, we'll save most of the questions for the full panel discussion at the end. And then one more announcement before we get started. Some of this material is going to touch on the Regulator Movement in North Carolina. And if you're intrigued by that topic, we do have a full program on the Regulator Movement coming up in May. And so in just a few minutes, I'll leave that registration link in the chat box. It's a virtual lunch and learn on May 24th. Okay, with no further hesitation, I'm happy to introduce the first speakers, 2 of my colleagues from the State Archives, Alison Thurman and Josh Hager. I'll start with Alison. Alison is a reference archivist, and she helps researchers through many channels: phone, email, snail mail, and she's in the search room with helping with reference almost every day. She is one of the co-authors of the blog series documenting the world of Outlander, and she's worked for the State Archives for 23 years. Josh Hager is an analyst for the government records section of the State Archives, and he joined the staff in 2014. In addition to co-authoring that blog series, he is the host of our quarterly virtual trivia night. And I'll add that registration link, because that's another event coming up in May, in the chat in just a moment. So we'll let them get started.
Thank you, Adrienne, for that kind introduction. And we can't wait to hear from Lindy and Jeremiah in a little bit. We're going to try to do some technology here to get the slide up and running. All right. As Adrienne mentioned, I'm Josh Hager, and joining me is Alison Thurman, and we are the co-authors of documenting the world of Outlander at the State Archives of North Carolina. Hopefully you've been reading our blog series for the past couple of years. If you haven't, they're all there for you, and on History for All the People. That is the blog for the State Archives. As you can see on the slide, we had the honor and privilege a few years ago of meeting Jamie Fraser, who came to the State Archives and posed with the state seal of North Carolina very gracefully, I might add. So
very much a surprise, and then he was on his way. But
exactly, he had important business to attend to at the Cherokee boundary, but we thanked him for stopping by. But let's go on to our next slide if I can. There we go. So we started our blog in November 13th, 2018. So 3.5 years at this point it's been going. So we're very happy about that. It continues today. Our most recent post was published a few weeks ago. And we're actually going to talk about that a little bit later. It's about a Cherokee chief. We have 3 seasons of the blog so far, and we have more to come on the blog. Yeah. We're currently working on entries on personal property and wills and estates. We're working on an entry on child records and what happens when you claim somebody is the parent of a child out of wedlock in North Carolina. We're working on what happens in a murder trial in colonial North Carolina, and a lot of other really interesting topics. So be on the lookout for that in the next few weeks.
Yes.
Yeah. And then I'm going to see if I can't share sound, because I wanted to share a familiar face to those of you who are watching. Diana Gabaldon came to the governor's mansion, not the same time as Jamie, and she recorded this message for us very gracefully about the blog.
Hello, I'm Diana Gabaldon, author of Outlander. If you're interested in learning more about North Carolina's connections with Outlander, you might want to visit the History for All the People blog at ncarchives.wordpress.com.
And we hope you follow her very sage advice.
Yes. Yes.
Hello.
There we go. So we are going to cover 5 topics in our discussion today. I'm going to go over mapping colonial North Carolina. And then I'm also going to cover our 3rd topic, which will be land grants and settling in North Carolina. And Alison, what are you going to tell us about?
Well, I'm going to be talking tonight about Cherokee land boundaries and militia records that are housed at the State Archives, as well as just kind of a sampling of documents pertaining to Governor Tryon and selections from our War of the Regulators regulation collection. The topics that you see here, the documents that we've been showcasing, have been chosen because we were very excited to be able to showcase documents to fans of Outlander and to history buffs that were relevant to topics and events that were happening on the show. So when you're looking at the slides that we're presenting and the documents that we're talking about, they've been chosen for that purpose.
Exactly. Our 2 presentations that are coming later will be more specifically about the contrast between what you've seen on screen and the reality of the situation. For our presentation, because Jamie and Claire aren't going to show up in archival records, obviously, we're going to tell you about what records they could have produced or the records around their lives. So let's get into that real quick. So first, I want to show you some maps. Everybody loves maps. We're going to start with a big picture map. This is one of the maps that Jamie and Claire could have actually used while they're here. This is a 1770 map surveyed by Bailey, Churton, Collett, and Hooper. It's usually called the Collett map or the Collett map, depending on who you're talking to. You'll notice that it's a pretty detailed map, but it's not entirely accurate. Take a look at some of the things along the coastline. The proportions aren't exactly right. Keep in mind, of course, surveying in this time period is as much as an art as it is a science. It's really difficult to be incredibly accurate. So all things considered, this team did a really good job, but there are some things you'll notice that aren't exactly where they're going to be. Now, the map here is a lot better than what would have been around, say, 50 years earlier, 100 years earlier. We do have some maps that go as far back as the 1500s in the State Archives collection, and those maps are completely off because things, especially in the interior, hadn't been mapped yet. And they also tend to include things like sea monsters and other strange things in the coast, which you'll see are not included in any of these maps. That kind of earlier kind of things in the maps are no longer going to be present in the 1770s for these maps. Yeah, here's a more, this map isn't nearly as visually appealing, but it's in a way more significant. This is from our vault collection. It's a plan of Wilmington situated on the east side of the northeast branch of the Cape Fear River. This is by Jeremiah Vale in 1743. So this is the earliest document we're showing you today. It predates the Fraser's arrival in North Carolina by about 20 years. But Wilmington is where they're coming into North Carolina. Wilmington is the major port for North Carolina. I'll say that with a caveat. It's a major port, it still is. But Wilmington and all of North Carolina, for that matter, lacks what other ports around us in other states have. We don't have a true deep water harbor in Wilmington. So a lot of commerce and a lot of immigration is coming through other places. Jamie and Claire come in through Wilmington and go up the Cape Fear River. but it wasn't uncommon for people coming to North Carolina to from Europe to sail into Virginia or into Charleston and then make their way by land into North Carolina. The coast off of North Carolina is called the Graveyard of the Atlantic from this time period, and it's no accident. Sea travel in that area is incredibly treacherous. So Wilmington is a major port city. It's the major port city, in addition to New Bern, which is a little more inland. We're going to hear a lot more about New Bern a little bit from Lindy, but it is not at the same scale of a port as Charleston, or, for example. And also, I do want to point out that you notice Wilmington is planned. It's in grids. Wilmington, Raleigh, all planned cities, very much unlike, say, New Bern or Bath or Beaufort, which were made more organically. And then this map is the last one we're going to highlight in this presentation. This is actually a very small piece of a very big map. This is the Mouzon map from 1775. And this is the first map that shows Rowan County on it. So Rowan County is the setting for the Fraser's Ridge and Outlander, although we know that the location of Fraser's Ridge is probably closer to Boone or Blowing Rock. Now, if you're not from North Carolina, Boone and modern day Rowan County are not together. Boone is in Watauga County, which is up in the far northwestern corner of the state. Rowan is in the western side, but it's not even in the mountains yet. Salisbury is the main city in Rowan County, was then, still is. Traveling from Boone to Salisbury was a bit of a trek. It would not have been nearly as quick as is shown on the show. But Rowan County in this time period started fairly where it starts now as far as eastern boundary, but the western boundary extended all the way into where North Carolina ends and beyond. Tennessee in this period doesn't exist. It's part of North Carolina. And that's about as far as your European settlers are going in the 1760s and 1770s. So if you had any business anywhere in that giant chunk of North Carolina, you're traveling all the way to Salisbury to the courthouse to handle it. Needless to say, eventually the counties will get broken up with petitions to the General Assembly. But this is the first map that we have in the archives that actually shows Rowan County on the map. So this, Jamie and Claire would have been in this area in 1775, or at least a few years earlier. So with that, since we now see in Rowan County happens to edge up to the Cherokee lands. So that sets us up for Alison to explore that topic.
Yes. So as Josh pointed out, Rowan County, we're trying to keep in mind, is a much larger area than it is today. So when they talk in the television series about Fraser's Ridge being close to Salem or Salisbury, it's a much larger stretch of land. However, to the west of Fraser's Ridge, their closest neighbors are going to be the Cherokee nation and tribes that live in that proximity. They are arriving in this area around 1767, and this is an important time period. At this point, there has been a lot of overland immigration into the historically Cherokee area. The end of the French and Indian War, 1763, there's a lot of immigration spilling over into that area. So there's some tensions and some reorganization that needs to be done, cooperation between the colonial government and the Cherokee to refix the boundaries of this area. So at the same time that Jamie and Claire are arriving in this area, Governor Tryon is working with chiefs from the Cherokee Nation on what is to become known as the Western Boundary Agreement. This is document, we weren't able to get the whole thing on here, but
it's massive.
It is. But it has been digitized as part of our digital collections that Adrienne mentioned earlier. So you'll have an opportunity to go in and view all of it. It's a very beautiful document. But what they're doing at this point is they are meeting together, plotting out lands and boundaries with the cooperation of the representatives from the colonial government, one of which is actually mentioned in the document as Alexander Cameron. fans of the show will recognize that name. He was actually portrayed in one of the more recent episodes this season when Jamie and Ian went to visit the Cherokee village, Alexander Cameron. So he's actually mentioned in this document. So the details were worked out. And I think that as we've seen in this season with Jamie acting as Indian superintendent of that area, this is what he would have been involved in. He would have been involved in this boundary agreement. So they are arriving at this very important time. There's several different documents about the Cherokee lands in the colonial governor's papers of William Tryon. And here we have an example of a map that was created not long after this agreement, the plan of the province line from the Cherokee line to Salisbury Road between North and South Carolina, 1772. So again, it's not that long afterwards. It's just a visual representation of the wording in the document. So it's kind of a nice visual. So the descriptions in the agreement itself come to life on this map. One example of that is that you do see the Cherokee line boundary, but in the description of the actual agreement, they talk about an area that they named Tryon Mountain. And if you look at the left side of the screen of the map, you can see where they have indicated Tryon Mountain on this map. So it's kind of a nice way to take the descriptions and then kind of visualize it.
Interestingly enough, I visited the Museum of the Cherokee Indian recently, and they discussed this plan and this agreement. And they actually talk about how within the Cherokee Nation, the perception was that everything was fine, and then the revolution, they were fine either way. But one of the things that they were sad about and lamenting in the narrative was that the revolution voided this agreement.
Yes, and this agreement was one of Governor Tryon's great accomplishments. I feel like his accomplishments are kind of overshadowed by some of the controversy during his time in North Carolina. But this was a great accomplishment that he was able to achieve during this time. So this is what Jamie and Claire, this is the area that they're living in and the year that they're arriving there.
So speaking of things that Jamie would have been doing as an agent of, an Indian agent or Native American agent, this is a really interesting document that we've recently discovered in the Treasurers and Comptrollers papers. It's from November 1770. A Cherokee chief named either Salo or Salo, we're not sure of the pronunciation, was traveling back from visiting the royal governor of Virginia and negotiating with the colonial government of Virginia. On his way back to the Cherokee lands, he fell sick and passed away at the house of Jacob Nichols, a settler. And Jacob Nichols then actually applied to the colonial government for compensation for burying Salo, as well as taking care of Salo's horse, until two representatives from the Cherokee Nation came to his house and took back the horse. And so we see here that Hugh Jenkins is the man who signs this agreement and gives the money to Nichols. And he actually gives Nichols a few pounds for taking care of the horse. We do find in other documents from the General Assembly session records, Colonial Assembly, I should say, that he actually received some shillings for the burial of Salo. So he received more money for taking care of the horse for what ended up being several months. But Hugh Jenkins is the person here who has the job that Jamie has on the show. Jamie would have been the one who signed off on something like this and would have made sure that Nichols was paid. If you read the document closely, it actually says that Nichols was taking care of the horse and took care of Salo at the direction of the superintendent. So Jamie would have been the one writing from Fraser's Ridge or from Salisbury, letting Jacob Nichols know that he's a chief, take care of him. If he passes away, take care of his horse. It's really crucial diplomatically. Like, we don't want to cause a diplomatic incident by mistreating him or his horse. We want to make sure everything is handled appropriately. It's ironic that the only reason we know about this incident and about this tragic end for this chief, who is actually known as the young warrior in the tribe, is because of this financial record. So we have it in the state archives because he was asking for compensation. So it's a really interesting, tragic document that Jamie would have been the one writing. But in this case, we have the real agent, Hugh Jenkins, who has Jamie's job in 1770. So let's get into land grants. This is actually the very first blog we ever wrote on Outlander. We thought it appropriate because how else are they going to get here? So this is an example of what a land grant looks like. A land grant is how most people immigrating to North Carolina who wanted land would have received it. You could potentially buy land, and we have a lot of deeds from this time period, but more commonly, new settlers would have land grants. Now, these new settlers don't have to be from Europe. They could be coming from another colony, and that happens too. But oftentimes you do see people from Europe who are buying land grants while they're still in Europe, or applying for land grants, and then they're taking it when they come over. So sometimes you see land grants where they start 1 year and then maybe end 5 or 10 years later because it's taken the people that long to come over and actually claim the land. It involved a pretty detailed process of plotting out the land, getting surveys done, an application process through a board, and on the next slide we'll get to who that authority would have been. And eventually you get issued this piece of paper, which essentially functions as your deed to go take possession of this property. And it would have been property not settled by any other European. Of course, it probably may have been settled by Native Americans, but the colonial government didn't care about that aspect too much. They did not grant lands in the Cherokee area at this point. They will later. The state government will. You see at the top of the land grant, you have a map. That's essentially the plot of the land. So remember, this is before you have addresses. This is before there are developed roads in a lot of places. This is as good as you're going to get for the location of this land that was awarded to Benaja Pennington in Rowan County, actually. This is amazingly one of the better maps for finding out where land is today because we have a river now and we have a natural feature that's still there. Oftentimes, these plots would say goes from John Smith's stump to Betty Brown's fence post, which are no longer there. I've seen rocks used as, things. I've seen trees, things that no one are going to be able to locate. So it's actually one of the most challenging things when you're doing archival research for your family. If you have a land grant, matching it up to exactly where that land is today, unless you can trace the deeds to a time period in the 20th century where you start having addresses or latitude and longitude, it's really difficult. It's very rewarding when you can do it, but it's truly difficult. And as we know in the show, Governor Tryon directly awarded the grant to Jamie and Claire. That's not usually how this process would have gone. There are two different kinds of land grants in this time period. There were royal land grants, which, yes, the royal governor is Tryon, and his name may show up on those grants. But there was a whole land office, and people would have applied to this land office. They would have assigned the grants. It is extraordinarily unlikely for the colonial governor to be the one personally deciding who gets every land grant.
That's very true. And especially, as Josh is going to talk a little bit later in just a minute about the Granville grants, that can be a little bit tricky when you're trying to show the true land grant process versus what they showed in the Outlander television series about how Jamie and Claire acquired their land, their 10,000 acres in Rowan County.
Mm-hmm.
Rowan County at this time was part of the Granville district, which if you want to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so the Granville district goes back to when North Carolina was founded as a colony. So North Carolina was not founded as a royal colony originally. It was founded as a colony of the Lords Proprietor, a proprietary colony. Mm-hmm. There were 8 different lords who were given parts of North Carolina to basically run as their own areas for economic gain. And some of the names if you're familiar with North Carolina. Carteret is one of them. Hyde, Beaufort, but the most famous, as far as land grants, is Lord Granville. The reason for that is the other lords proprietors found North Carolina to not be economically lucrative. And in fact, North Carolina wasn't lucrative for most folks until the 20th century. But Granville, they went another path. Granville's district was started at the northern boundary of the colony and worked its way fairly south. There's a large swath across the northern part of what's now North Carolina that would have been in Lord Granville's district. And getting a land grant in that area would have required going through not the royal office, but directly through Lord Granville's land office. And here's an example on screen of a Granville grant taken from our microfilm to Abraham James in 1761, signed by Lord Granville. But there is a small time period during which Jamie and Claire comes over where the Granville office has shut down. Alison, you want to talk about that?
Yes, when the original Lord died and his son inherited that Granville district, which again, keep in mind is a huge area of North Carolina at this time. He inherited it. The land office closed in 1763 when Lord Granville died. So that's where it gets a little bit tricky. From 1763 for about 7-8 years after that, no longer than 10, the Granville land office was not open. It's during this time in 1767 that Governor Tryon is saying, well, I'll give you this land in the Granville district if you are going to help settle it, attract new settlers to that area. So whether or not he had the authority to really do that on his own is questionable. But however, we can say that historically that land office in the Granville district was closed in 1767.
But the land Fraser's Ridge occupies would have definitely been in the Granville district. Now, we also have land grants after statehood. This process actually goes on until the early 20th century, basically giving away any piece of land. And of course, the plots get smaller and smaller over time of what they're giving. And actually, while in this time period it's for settlers, after statehood, land grants become a form of payment. So if you have people, we've already seen people in the show who are going to be in a few years serving in the Revolution. We know that. We don't know maybe who or what they're going to do yet, but there's going to be a few who are in the Revolution. And if they serve in the North Carolina Continental Line or the North Carolina Militia, there's a good chance that they'll be awarded a land grant for their service if they survive. And if they don't, their next of kin will receive a land grant and will apply for it. So that'll be a very common thing. And a lot of these land grants they're awarding to these veterans end up being in Eastern Tennessee. So that we have some of those land grants still in our archives for what is now Tennessee. And speaking of service, let's talk about the militia records.
Yes. The militia records that are housed at the state archives for our time period of interest are referred to as the troop returns. They are a collection that began around 1747 is when they're going to begin, but the bulk of the records that pertain to this time period is going to be from around 1763 up to about 1794. So that's the main time period that you're going to be finding these records. And a very quick overview of the militia, which is deserving of its own 2-hour presentation itself. But the fundamental constitutions of 1667, the very first, as Josh mentioned, proprietary charter and laws for the colony called for a militia. This was neglected, very, very much neglected. 1711, you have the Tuscarora War. It became painfully obvious how unequipped and how unprepared they were. French and Indian War at the end of that, and when there's some more hostilities going on with the Cherokee, when that's kind of that tension period that we talked about a little bit earlier. The militia laws were adapted over the years. So they did become more efficient. They had more training. They were able to receive more funding for their equipment. So mustering laws required more training. So by the time of the Regulator Movement, they're much more efficient and helpful for the provincial army during that time period. These troop returns consist of lists, muster rolls, payrolls, that mainly are pertaining to the militia. There's also, we have here an example on the screen of a muster roll from Currituck County from the 1750s. North Carolina has had a very long history of dividing the different counties into militia districts. And then they would name the districts after the captain of the company of that district. So you will see a lot of times on these records, they're arranged by the captain's name. They could also be organized by the county or the militia district within the county. Jamie's role, we know that he's the colonel of the Rowan County area, the colonel of the regiment. So his role in this would have been to oversee these company captains, make sure that they are compiling these lists, these muster rolls. He would also be overseeing the duties of the other officers of the companies that make up the whole regiment. He'd also be out recruiting and mustering non-commissioned officers or privates, if you want to say so, ordinary citizens, making sure that the company captains compiled these lists and made sure they were up to date. Also recording muster days, who was reporting for muster, who was not, the reasons why they weren't reporting, those are also reported. And so if they were called into active service, he would have also been responsible for making sure that it was recorded if they were wounded, if there were prisoners taken, and then the field return. And we want to show an example
Of course.
of that. The field returns, as we saw on the screen previously, though, I want to point out that the muster rolls and payrolls will include the names of the individual members of the company. The field returns, this is a wonderful example of a very unusually detailed field return from the Wilmington district. So as typical with these field returns, they will give you the number and the names of the companies that were involved once they have returned from either mustering or service that they've been called into. The companies that are present and absent, the officers and privates, noticing again the number, not necessarily the names of those. But this one even goes down to the number of drummers and fifes that there were. So these records have been digitized and they're available for searching and viewing on our digital collections. They're arranged either by county again, or you can also search by date. You can search them by date. But again, this is a huge part of Jamie's responsibility as colonel of the regiment. And we saw in the season 5 him going out and recruiting, and that would have been very much what he would have been doing. And we wanted to show just a couple of kind of examples from a couple of other collections that we've written about briefly. The example here that we have, list of land grants to Scots, the Isle of Jura. Again, very exciting to find this because it's from 1767. So we're talking about the same time period. This document is recording immigrants from the northern part of Scotland, those islands up there at the top. So it's kind of the same area, that Highland area that the Frasers would have been coming from. This particular list is part of the William Tryon colonial governor's official correspondence. The reason why is because apparently, according to this document, His Excellency has granted these people land. Again, a little tricky, but that's the story that the documents tell us. But this is a great document because it lists the names of the Scots that were allotted these land grants, the acreage that they received, and these particular Scots were settling in the Cumberland County, very, very likely area, Cross Creek, which we visited with the Frasers several times. That's that Cumberland County area, so that's very accurate. Also Mecklenburg County, they were settling there. But again, very exciting to find it. We assist people who are researching genealogy quite frequently. That's one of the main researchers that we come in contact with. This is a perfect kind of document. When Roger and Brianna were doing research before they traveled back to Jamie and Claire, when they were trying to find out more about North Carolina and more about where they might be, if they had found a document like this would have been extremely helpful and very exciting. So it's one that we liked to showcase. This other document that we have here is part of the War of the Regulation Papers. And we're going to hear a lot more about the Regulator Movement and the Alamance battlefield later on, but we do have a collection of records that pertain to that time period and that movement. It's part of our larger military collection. But this document is actually pertains to Herman Husband. Quick background on Herman Husband. He is one of the leaders of the Regulator Movement. Interesting gentleman. He was living in the Orange County area, large property owner, but he was very sympathetic to the Regulator Movement. He believed that there needed to be government reform, which was one of the concerns of the regulators in that area. So his main contribution to the movement was through speeches and his pamphlets that he wrote. So he was not very popular with the local government officials. He was arrested a couple of times, but he, this is a receipt, for example, of pay to Thomas Sitgreaves for taking Herman Husband the night he was expelled from the assembly. He actually was elected to serve in the General Assembly, a 1769 to 1770 session from the residents of Orange County. So he was legitimately serving in the assembly when he was charged with inciting a riot during that session and arrested and taken to New Bern. He was released in February 1771, so it's just in time for him to be able to be a participant at the events in May at Alamance. He was at Alamance, the Regulator camp, but he was trying to arrange a truce. He did not want to become involved in any violence. He realized that tensions at this point were just very high. And as a Quaker, he proclaimed that his beliefs prevented him from being associated with violence. So he actually left and did not participate. He's one of 4 Regulator leaders that Governor Tryon did not offer a pardon to. He was very much considered a traitor, and he left the state, died in Pennsylvania later on. But he was also, the Regulators felt that he had abandoned them at the time that they kind of needed him the most. So his legacy is a little, both sides have their issues with him. But this is a great find, just something that we also have other documents pertaining to Herman Husband, the writ of arrest, for example, we have that as well. But Herman Husband would have been the kind of leader and orator that would have inspired characters like Murtaugh, Fitzgibbons, Fraser. As we saw in season 5, he was a member of the Regulator Movement. And he's the kind of regulator that would have been inspired by someone like Herman Husband.
Mm-hmm. I love this document because it's written so matter-of-factly, but the story is so interesting. It's like, oh yeah, this is a receipt for pay for taking the main regulator into custody. It's like, exactly. You know, such a,
he got £5
yeah.
It. But I think that that's kind of a sampling of what we wanted to talk about. We began the blog, as Josh said, you know, we were fans of the show, and we're, as archivists, we really thought it would be fun to share these documents with other Outlander fans and history buffs, and to kind of use them as a way to look into the window of this time period the Frasers would have been living in. So again, that's why these particular documents have been chosen, because of their correlation to the topics and events that we've seen in the television show. So it's been a lot of fun.
Yes, and we look forward to continuing it.
We do, and Outlander fans are great. So we
and the Stones call you. Come to the archives. Alison's the correspondence archivist. She's waiting for your emails. We're waiting to see you in the search room. We can't time travel you literally, but we will travel you back in time with all the records that we have. So please come to the state archives. And with that, I'll hand it back to Adrienne. Thank you so much for having us tonight.
Yes, thank you.
All right, so we're going to gear up for our next speaker, and it's my pleasure to welcome Lindy Cummings to the panel. She is the research historian at Tryon Palace. That's a position she's held for 6 years. And if she wasn't an expert on colonial North Carolina history before she took that position, she certainly is now. And she's been answering some questions in the chat. The last one was especially tough, so we might open that up at the end for everyone to talk about. But anyway, we really appreciate her expertise here tonight. So take it away, Lindy.
All right, thank you. Let me see if I can get my screen share up here. Here we are. All right. Okay, here we go. We're off. Thanks. I'm really pleased to have the chance to share a little bit about with you about Newbern and the palace. And comparatively, we'll talk about 3 different facets here: the town, the palace, and the people who called the palace home. And I did a little tally from my kind of worn out copy of A Breath of Snow and Ashes. And I think of the roughly 1,000 pages of that volume, there are a mere 9 that are dedicated to Claire's experiences in the palace itself. But I have to say that those 9 pages have done a lot to generate interest in Tryon Palace over the last few years. And for those of us who work at the palace, we are kind of holding our breaths as the Stars series builds to what we hope will be a palace cameo. If not in this season, then hopefully in next season. So if you arrived in Newbern in 1775, what would you find? It was one of the largest urban centers in the colony, which really isn't saying much because there aren't that many urban centers in the colony. Founded in 1710 by a group of Swiss and Palatine immigrants, it had grown very slowly initially, but by 1775, it was an active port town comparatively. As Josh and Alison mentioned, those barrier islands, they're both protecting the town and the coastline from direct approach by large vessels, pirates, French, the Spanish. But the shallow inlet at Ocracoke allowed smaller vessels to come in of approximately 20 to 50 tons. So we're thinking mostly sloops and schooners would have been coming up the river. The colony itself was engaged largely in trade with mostly New England and in the West Indian ports. And for Newbern, only a very small portion of their trade is going to be directly with Great Britain. Most of their trade is going to be with elsewhere. And that's in comparison to Wilmington, where they're going to do a larger bulk of their trade directly with Great Britain. Exports out of the port of Newbern included tar, turpentine, pitch, lumber, deerskins, agricultural products, and livestock. Most importantly for Newbern, the General Assembly rotated through the major towns along the coast. So they would meet in one spot, and then the next time they met in a different place. But by the time that Claire and Jamie are settled in the province, Newbern and Wilmington are really vying as the primary meeting places. Newbern, the centrality of it eventually won out. And so William Tryon settled the capital there permanently. But that was actually after several previous attempts by his predecessors to do so. So if you came into Newbern in 1775, approximately, you would have found a good church. And that is point A on the map here, which is a 1769 engraving done after C.J. Sautier. He was a cartographer who came over at Tryon's behest. This would, of course, been an Anglican church. That church in its 3rd version still stands today on the same site. There was also a courthouse. It was kind of in a state of, chronic construction in this period and would eventually, I believe, burnt to the ground and had a couple of buildings that succeeded it. There was also a jail, which, of course, if you've read A Breath of Snow and Ashes, you know Claire is intimately familiar with. There's also a school up in number H, and that was a frame structure, but would later be replaced by a brick building, which still stands today. And then, of course, the kind of major feature of the city, you have the palace itself here to the western edge of town on a rise overlooking the Trent River. When Claire arrived at the palace, the edifice was about 5 years old at that point. And the first bricks had been put in place in 1767. There was an English-born architect, John Hawkes, who was overseeing that. He had accompanied Tryon to the province in 1764. Some of those building materials had to be imported. The colony was not able to provide those materials. They ordered their window sashes, glass, interior hardware like hinges and locks. Those all came from England, as did lead for the gutter work, plumbing, and for the roofing. The mahogany wood would have been from the West Indies, but it probably would have come by way of England. So mahogany wood would have been produced, shipped to England, and then probably shipped back here. There's a chance it might have come to a local port straight from the West Indies. Tryon was proudest of his imported fireplace surround for the council chamber that was done of Sienna marble. Labor too was a problem. North Carolina had a shortage of skilled workers, so they actually had to send to Philadelphia to hire those skilled workmen. And then of course they would have had some local labor that they would have engaged with. So in June of 1770, the palace was in such a state of completion, but not yet complete, that Tryon and his family were actually able to move in. In October, the Royal Council met there for the first time, and then they had a grand opening December 5th, 1770. And that was when all the members of the assembly were called to meet Tryon there, and he thanked the colony for the gift of this very elegant and noble structure, a palace that is a public ornament and a credit to the colony. Here you have the plan of the governor's house at Newbern. This is from a set that was sent to the Board of Trade for approval. When Josiah Martin, who shows up in A Breath of Snow and Ashes, of course, and I believe, I'm not up to date on this season of Outlander, I'm a few episodes behind, but I believe he is in one of the upcoming episodes. I'm excited about that. He was a man of fine taste. He enjoyed the finer things in life. And when he came, he declared that the town was made extremely delectable by the accommodation provided at great charge to the province, according to the elegant taste of Mr. Tryon. There are a couple of other places that hold palace plans. There's some preliminary plans that actually ended up in New York and the Historical Society there. And there's actually a map of the grounds and the gardens that ended up in Caracas, Venezuela. And we will look at those in just a moment. Kind of tying back to Josh and Alison's talk about what the archives hold. One of the documents we are fortunate enough to have is the original estimate for the palace's construction. And you think got a nice list there of all the construction materials, including labor. And the Hawkes estimate came in at about 10,000 pounds. It exceeded that by about 5,000 additional pounds. And so it was an expensive building. But, you know, in its favor, nothing like it had ever been built in North Carolina, and hardly anything like it had been built in any other mainland North American colony. It really is kind of unique in that way. So there's also some wonderful receipts for the original work, plus work that was done by Martin to kind of improve the structure. So the layout of the palace is really interesting. You have the main house, and then you have your two flanking outbuildings. You have a kitchen wing here to the east and a stable building to the west. And that's what you'll see when you come on site today, even though two of those structures, the main building and the kitchen, are 1950s reconstructions. So in the main building, the rooms are designated counterclockwise. A is the entrance hall and B is the library. Of course, there's a couple of scenes from the book that take place in the library. C is the council chamber where that fine Sienna marble fireplace surround would have been located. D is a dining room. E is a parlor. F is a housekeeper's room. And then G is a servant's hall. In the 1783 description of the palace that John Hawkes actually sent to a a visitor there, someone who had visited New Bern and then had gone home. He sent him a description of the house. He actually said that D was a parlor, E was a dining room, and G was a steward's office. And that's actually how we interpret those spaces today. H and I are your two sets of staircases in the center of the building. I is a lesser stairs where servants, children, enslaved people are going to be coming and going, where they're out of sight, out of mind of guests and the important people. H is your better stairs, the grand stairs, and that's where you have your fine mahogany fittings. The kitchen wing was a separate building, and L is the hearth room. And you can see what a really nice wide hearth it has here for open fire cooking. There is a built-in bake oven right next to it. That's very convenient. And then there's 3 copper boilers for keeping a lot of hot water on hand. So that's kind of a, delightful 18th century feature there that would have been fairly unusual on this side of the ocean, at least in the North American colonies. M is a scullery, N is a laundry, and then K was designated as an office for the governor's secretary. Then upstairs, you would have had a variety of sleeping chambers for servants and enslaved people and anyone else who's there working in any kind of labor capacity in the palace. So the grounds is probably one of the areas that we know the least about, both from a documentary perspective and an archaeological perspective. There are 2 18th century drawings of the grounds. The one to the left is from the Sauthier map of 1769. It shows the grounds, the landscaped grounds to the north of the palace. This would be modern day Pollock Street running across the top here. And then of course you have the Trent River down at the bottom. By contrast, in 1783, Hawks sent a description to his Venezuelan correspondent that shows the exact opposite. The landscaped grounds are on the south lawn between the south side of the palace and the river's edge. And then you have open lawns up here between the north side of the palace and Pollock Street. Archaeological testing in the 1950s and 1990s did not uncover any evidence that conclusively supported the gardens being located on the north side between the front of the palace and Pollock Street. And unfortunately for the south side of the palace, this part of the palace, when they reconstructed that area, they added about 8 to 14 feet of fill dirt over what was the ground at that point to kind of raise it up out of the floodplain. So that makes it extremely difficult to actually get down to strata that would date to the 18th century. And that area also was robustly developed after the palace burned. And there were homes, businesses, and fueling stations with underground tanks. And of course, all of those had to be taken out. And that would have impacted what kind of evidence we would be able to find if we were ever able to get down that low. All right, so who would have been living in the palace? Claire observes a number of people who called the palace home in 1775. And at the time, the most prominent residents would, of course, been the ones that, from a documentary aspect, remain the most visible today. And that was Josiah Martin and his family. These are 3 of a handful of known Martin family portraits. Josiah on the left here, he had this portrait done by a fairly prominent portrait painter when he was in London. This was one of 2 that he had done. The center portrait here is his only surviving son, Josiah Henry. And this is I believe it's a pastel. It's actually in our collection. We're fortunate to have that. And this was done while Josiah Henry was a student in England. And then to the right, there is Josiah's eldest daughter, Mary Elizabeth. This was a portrait commissioned by her grandfather, who was also a Josiah Martin. And it hung in her grandfather's house in New York for many years, and now it's in Massachusetts in a collection there. But those were not the only people. This was a fairly robust household, and it was a young household. We're talking about people who were in their mid to late 30s. You have Josiah Martin, and they have their very young family. They had a lot of children, and like many people of that era, very few of those children survived to adulthood. Josiah Henry was their only surviving male adult son, but he died without a family of his own. So the Martin family from this part of the family is no longer in existence. Any male descendants would be from one of his brothers or an extended family member. Several of those children died while they were living either in New York or North Carolina. The son, Sam, we do know, died while they were living in New Bern. The household also consisted of friends and staff. Martin's friend from Antigua, Archibald Nielsen, was just about 30 years old. He had come at Martin's invitation, and he lived part-time in the palace, some in Edenton, where he worked as a merchant, and he also filled some civil service posts. James Beagleston and his wife served in some household capacities. Beagleston was probably working as well, we know he was working as a secretary, and Carolyn was probably working in some capacity as a housekeeper. And I think probably the character of George Webb from A Breath of Snow and Ashes, even though that character is fictional, that he's probably a composite of Nielsen and Beagleston. And then most importantly for us, we do know the name of some of the enslaved laborers who would have worked at the palace in this period. Toole, a cook, Prima, Kate or Katie. She's also identified as Mulatto Kate, and then Kate's daughter, Bess. All were sent without their consent from Antigua to North Carolina by Josiah's father, Samuel. And Bess was a part of Mary Elizabeth's inheritance from her grandfather. We assume that these four probably accompanied the Martin family when they left New Bern in 1775 and returned to New York, but we really don't know. It wasn't a priority for the family at that point to mention what they were doing with those staff. And then there were possibly as many as 6 white English house staff that Martin had hired from London and had purchased liveries for them, very fine liveries, on his father's tab, which was a point of sore point between them. So the later years, so of course, Claire leaves the palace and we don't really hear anything more about the palace. Maybe it'll pop up in the newest novel. I haven't started it yet. But after May 1775, the revolutionary fervor was such in North Carolina that Martin really no longer felt safe and secure. And unlike depicted in the novels and in the show, he did not have a contingent of armed British regulars or Marines at his disposal. The defense of the province depended on militia. And of course, Jeremiah is going to be talking more about that. And critically for Martin, most of the militia leaders who had supported Tryon against the regulators, these are the men who are now the leading figures of North Carolina's revolutionary faction. So with the help of Archibald Nielsen, Martin put his family on a ship bound for New York. And then he and Archibald flee to Fort Johnston near Wilmington, and then eventually decamp for the security of a Royal Navy sloop cruiser in the harbor there. So with Martin gone, the new revolutionary government continued to use the palace. The first revolutionary governor, Richard Caswell, resided at New Bern for a short time. And in fact, he purchased a large quantity of Martin's furniture when the state put it up for auction to generate funds for the revolutionary cause. But by the end of the war, the building was in disrepair. It was vulnerable to vandalism. Locals were stripping it for all of its valuable facets. And the assembly were forced to pay watchmen and caretakers. And by the 1780s, they really just wanted to sell the decaying structure. In the later period, its most famous visitor was George Washington. He visited on his 1791 Southern tour, and he remarked that the palace was a good brick building, but now hastening to ruins. The building was put up for sale after the capital moved to Raleigh in 1794. They were going to sell it for as little as a good crop of tobacco, but people did not feel that any one of them was fine enough to actually live in such a house. So they rented out rooms for a while. And then eventually on the night of February 28th, 1798, the main building burnt to the ground. The townspeople were able to save the wings for a short time, although the kitchen disappeared at some point. We're not really sure what happened to it, but it disappeared in the early 19th century. So until the commemoration and restoration efforts got underway in the early to mid 20th century, the palace was really gone, but it wasn't forgotten. There was a lot of interest in it, and the public memory was built up around it. And I think that, Outlander is part of that continuing layering of memory. Some of it's factual, and a lot of it is fictional, both then and now. And I find it personally interesting that Tryon came to stand in as a proxy for the abuse, right or wrong. I mean, I think Alison's right that he doesn't really get credit for some of the good things that he did. But he came to stand for a proxy of abuse of the American colonists by the British Crown. But despite the fact that the palace is, kind of his creation, it remains largely untarnished by association. So today we interpret a symbol of British imperial splendor as a hallmark of the American democratic spirit. And while Tryon and Martin would undoubtedly find that inconceivable, as would probably most North Carolinians of that period, I think that we would all still agree that in Tryon's words, the palace continues to be an ornament to the period. So very quickly, we have some themed tours based around Outlander that our staff do. In addition to our daily tours 7 days a week. You can find out more at our website. Not all of these Outlander themed tours run concurrently, and they do tend to sell out very quickly. So if you're interested in purchasing tickets, it's best to do that as early as possible. And I think we've already had our April event. So I think May is the next one. And if you have any more questions, because this was a very quick and dirty tour through the palace history, please feel free to reach out to me. I've got my email here, and I'm happy to answer any Outlander and palace related questions or just palace questions. So thank you.
Thank you, Lindy. And we've had some folks in the chat talking about visiting Tryon Palace and even remembering when it was built. So lots of interest. So last but not least, it's my pleasure to introduce Jeremiah Degennaro. Jeremiah is the Historic Site Manager for Alamance Battleground, and he has been with Historic Sites since 2008. Thanks for being with us tonight, Jeremiah.
Thank you so much for having me. And while Lindy is eagerly awaiting Tryon Palace's moment on Outlander, Alamance Battleground has already had its moment in the spotlight. And so I'm going to be talking a little bit about how the show depicts the Battle of Alamance. And my talk is titled Outlander Fact and Fiction. Because if you're looking at the show and the books to a lesser extent and how it shows the Battle of Alamance, it's really a little bit of both. Of course, you would come to expect some kind of artistic license when you're putting together something for television. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of those creative decisions and try and give a little bit of background on the historical story of the Regulators and the Battle of Alamance. All right, so first I do want to give a little bit of background about the Regulator Movement, which leads to this battle. And that's mostly because the books do a very good job of giving a little bit of context and a little bit more understanding of what this was all about. But the TV show, just for interest of time, what often happens when people talk about the Regulator Movement is that it is very easy to over-rely on taxes as a driver of political frustration in the backcountry of North Carolina. And while taxes are one of the issues, there are a lot of other more complicated issues that are at play here. So the Regulator Movement is a reform movement of backcountry farmers. It's mostly poor farmers who own small pieces of land, and they're protesting corruption among local government officials who are also either friends with or they themselves are a class of wealthy land speculators. And you have this group of speculators that are taking advantage of poor farmers. And what the farmers want to do is they want to regulate this system that favors a wealthy elite. And even though this is before the United States of America has been founded, they do a very American thing that we see throughout our history. They organize. And so these farmers start having meetings, they form associations, they're writing petitions, signing them. So there are some really great documents that actually have the names and the signatures of some of these regulators. And they ask nicely for things to change. But those petitions go to the people in power who don't really have interest in changing things. And so nothing really changes over the course of about 5 years. And so tension just builds and frustration builds. Diana Gabaldon's books do a good job of showing the development of that movement. And as that frustration builds, ultimately, some of the regulators turn to violence. And so rather than writing a petition to someone in power, they take that person and they physically assault them and beat them up. The instance of violence that really is a turning point in this movement that leads on pretty much directly to the Battle of Alamance is a riot in Hillsborough when the Superior Court is in session. Regulators had been trying to take some of these land speculators to court. Land speculators and other wealthy elite were countersuing, and the way that the power system worked at that time, all of the wealthy land speculators, all of the government officials, they are either officials of the court as well, or they are friends with officials of the court, and the regulators are fighting against what they call a courthouse ring. And after one particularly bad court session in March of 1770, the regulators realized that they're not going to have access to justice, and so they are going to enact justice in their own way, whatever way they can. So when the fall session begins in September of 1770, a mob of at least 100 regulators descend on the town of Hillsborough, make their way into the courtroom, and they begin dragging out judges, lawyers, justices of the peace. They're dragging them into the street. They're right in the heart of historic Hillsborough, and they're beating up these people with whips and switches. They're using brickbats, which is to say that they're taking pieces of brick or rock and they're just hurling them at people, all in a very targeted way. It's not just wanton destruction. They know who they have a problem with, and so they find those people and drag them out of the building. When those people are able to escape, then they then target the homes and the buildings that are owned by these people. So if not targeting their physical bodies, they're targeting their property. One of the most well-known examples of this during the Hillsborough riot is the home of Edmund Fanning, who's one of these members of the courthouse ring, who is targeted first in the riot himself. He's dragged out of the court building, and the description, it's my favorite, it says that he's grabbed by the ankles and he's pulled out, and they make sure that as he's pulled down the stairs, his head strikes violently against every step. Once he's out in the street, then they're just pummeling him and do grievous damage to his eye socket. He believes that he might lose his eye. He ends up getting better, but they do a lot of damage to these people. And when news of the riot in Hillsborough gets to Governor Tryon, he realizes that he's lost control in the backcountry, and there has to be a violent reaction to the riot and to the regulators in general. And it's actually one of the scenes that shows up in an early episode of season 5. And I've got a couple of screenshots here, kind of showing what the riot in Hillsborough was depicted as. I'm going to point out a couple things that were pretty good. In the upper right-hand corner, you've got Edmund Fanning being pulled out of a building. He gets pummeled in a similar way. They even do some makeup on his eye later on in the episode. So they did read a little bit about what happened to him. It did involve a lot of people. You'll note, let's see, on the right-hand side in the middle, there's a burning effigy wearing a red coat, of course, that's the international symbol for bad guys, a red coat. So they're going to use that for the effigy. It's interesting to note that the regulators actually did break into Edmund Fanning's home, and before they tore it down, they did take his, they said his wearing clothes, and they strung them up on a pole, and they paraded them through the street. So that is something that actually happened. What they didn't do was set fire to that effigy or really play around with any large bonfires, because in the middle of an established town like Hillsborough, where most of the buildings are made out of wood, large bonfires and uncontrolled fires are a really, really bad idea. And it would lead to a more wanton destruction than what the regulators were looking at. And of course, this being a depiction of a crowd action right on the eve of the American Revolution, of course, they're going to have a tarring and feathering. That is obviously how everybody throughout North America would show their distaste with an official. Very popular in historical memory. Obviously, it's very evocative. It's not something that happened in the riot in Hillsborough for a very, very specific reason. Tarring and featherings were common in port cities. Boston has a few, several throughout New England. And that's because they have a lot of tar. It's the glue that holds ships together. It's the waterproofing on ropes. And it is something that is readily available. A lot of it is being made in North Carolina even, but not in Hillsborough. That's an area that is well inland. There's no maritime industry. You're actually past that coastal plain where most of the longleaf pine was, that was ideal for tar production. And so Hillsborough just wouldn't have had that stuff. And so they wouldn't have gone to the trouble to boil tar, get feathers, when really all they needed to do was, grab somebody and pummel him with pieces of brick and whips. So after that riot in Hillsborough, Governor Tryon has a military solution that he has in mind. He historically does not have access to a standing army. So what he does instead is he calls out the militia. He sends messages to all of his county militia commanders, of which Jamie would have been one for Rowan County at the time. And he instructs them on how many people they need to raise, what equipment they need, and where to meet. What the county militia commanders are in charge of is paying bounties and paying a daily wage to any volunteer who comes into the militia. Now, in the first session, there was a discussion about militia laws, and it is true that at the time, if the governor called out the militia, you were obligated to go, and you were obligated to muster several times a year. In this particular case, Governor Tryon did not want conscripts necessarily. He didn't want an army of draftees. He wanted people who were volunteering and who kind of wanted to be there, especially since they were going to be going to war against fellow North Carolinians. So when Tryon raises that militia and calls for volunteers, the militia commanders are paying out of pocket for the bounty, which is kind of like a signing bonus, and then that amount of money that they would get as a daily wage. Since this is happening during the spring planting season, most of these people would have been farmers, and so they were going to be losing money by not being able to work their own farms. And all of those expenses of the county officers, like Jamie, would have eventually been reimbursed. But apart from that, the colony of North Carolina didn't really have a lot of money for a large standing army. So everyone who volunteered for militia duty had to bring their own weapon. So it's not, brown besses all the way down. It's, maybe a home-built rifle, a fowling piece of some kind, maybe a very old surplus military musket. It was, you'd say used in the French and Indian War or even earlier. And then as far as uniforms, the militia did not have any specific instructions on what they were supposed to wear. There was no attempt at uniformity, and there was not the money to pay for regimental redcoats, like what you see here in this screenshot from the Battle of Alamance episode of Outlander in season 5. But it takes too long to explain that, and it's difficult to have that kind of exposition in a television show. And also, you have a kind of a hard time figuring out who the bad guys are. And so I think that's a big reason why part of the militia that Jamie is commanding, they are shown wearing their own civilian clothing that they would have had from home. But then by and large, a very large portion of the militia is shown to be wearing British redcoats. And at this time in 1771, there were no British regulars really that were posted in North Carolina. There were much bigger issues going on in other parts of North America. Boston is a complete powder keg at this point that had already come very close to exploding with the Boston Massacre. You already have bloodshed, but it's not open warfare. And meanwhile, Governor Tryon is definitely ensuring to his superiors that he has the situation under control through the use of a civilian militia. All right, so what did those militia members really look like? We have a screen cap from the episode showing what Jamie is wearing. And on the right, this is excuse me. This is one of our North Carolina Historic Sites employees. This is Scott Douglas. He's the site manager at Fort Dobbs in Statesville, and he assists us with our living history programs and has a great impression of Tryon's militia. So what you see here is the civilian clothing of the early 1770s, and you'll note a couple things that might stand out to you if you look at his hat. Both he and Jamie are wearing this yellow ribbon. This is what's known as a cockade. And we do have documentation that shows that there were yellow cockades that were issued out to some of the militia. When Tryon sends his note to all of the county militia commanders, he does require that they have a cockade for every single man who enlists with them. And he also says that they need to be issued a haversack, which is a linen bag that you use to carry food, which is not a civilian item, it's a military item. And then a pair of leggings. And you can't really see what Jamie is wearing, but if you look at the picture of Scott on the right, you can see the top part of those leggings, which basically covers the lower half of the legs and covers up those stockings and the lower part of the breeches that are so common in the 18th century. But apart from that cockade, good way to tell friend at the Battle of Alamance, because the regulators and the rank and file in the militia are all wearing their regular clothing of the time period. They would have looked as different from each other as if you just took a collection of people today in the clothing that they have all together. So one thing that does not get really mentioned in the show, but that I wanted to call attention to was this last sort of moment that escalates the tension just before the Battle of Alamance. Governor Tryon's battle plan was to raise militia companies in the east and have one of his officers, Hugh Waddell, raise militia companies in the west and have them coalesce at Salisbury, and then the two of them were going to connect somewhere in the backcountry. But shortly before the Battle of Alamance, Hugh Waddell and his force, which was already under strength, he was having a hard time getting volunteers. He gets actually blocked on the wrong side of the Yadkin River. And it was noted on May 11th, 1771, that one of his captains made an oath saying that he had passed along the lines of the regulators in arms, meaning that they were armed, drawn up on ground he was acquainted with. The foot, which is to say the infantry, appeared to him to extend 1/4 mile, 7 or 8 deep, and the horse to extend 120 yards, 12 or 14 deep. So you've got these probably thousands of people who are on the other side of the Yadkin River that are waiting for Hugh Waddell to bring his force up. And all of those regulators are able to compel Waddell to retreat back to Salisbury. Waddell sends a messenger to Tryon with a note that he has him memorize rather than write down, lest he be captured. And he sends it to Governor Tryon. The writer arrives a few days later, and when Tryon gets that news, he realizes that he has to now go to the rescue of Hugh Waddell. The next thing that happens around the same time, though Tryon does not find out about it until after the battle, is that there's a wagon load of powder and other military items that are meant to be going to the militia, and it gets ambushed. And the note from Tryon's documentation of this campaign says that 9 persons all went thence disguised to Captain Pfeiffer's old muster ground, where they found and stopped the wagons and inquired for the powder that was carrying to General Waddell. They found the powder and took it out of the wagon, broke open the hogsheads and kegs that contained the powder, and set the same on fire and destroyed blankets, leggings, kettles, and other things. And so I wanted to note these because looking back on it now 251 years later, we think, oh, the regulators didn't really stand a chance. But the week leading up to the battle, they're able to marshal around thousands of people. They're blocking part of the militia at Salisbury. They're intercepting and ambushing baggage trains, blowing them up. And really, if you were looking at the situation just a few days before the battle, you would say that this would be a close run thing, and the outcome of this battle would be very much in doubt. So with that in mind, Governor Tryon continues into the backcountry. He's not going to retreat back to New Bern. He's got a battle plan. He's got people, and he's going to fight a battle. Once he crosses the Great Alamance Creek, though, and he's really in close to the heart of Regulator country, he's operating from a very defensive posture. So this is a close-up of Sautier's map of the battlefield. And if you can see this sort of inverted V of those red lines, those are all of the locations of each militia company in Tryon's militia. He has both of his flanks, his sides, sort of up against Alamance Creek. So he's got protection on both sides, and then that V is going to form a salient. It's the strongest position he can put his militia in, because he's very, very concerned that as soon as he gets over that creek and is in his camp, the regulators are going to swarm his camp and attack. He's trying to bolster his position with artillery as well, and there's quite a bit of concern about what is going to happen at this point. Now, kind of going back to how this is depicted in the show, there are a couple really great scenes where first the last petition of the regulators makes its way to Governor Tryon in his camp. And in his lines in the show, Tim Downey, the actor who plays Governor Tryon, he's referring to the things that are written in this petition, and he says, they say that, the lives of His Majesty's subjects are not toys to be trifled with. Well, I am not to be trifled with. And that was really neat to see, because he was actually quoting from the regulators' last petition, where they do say that the lives of His Majesty's subjects are not toys. And they try to have one last meeting. They ask him to meet with them. But by this time, Governor Tryon is pretty much decided that he is going to order the regulators to disperse, and he's going to fire on them if they will not disperse. And that leads to what was my favorite scene in this episode, showing the Battle of Alamance. And you see, 2 screenshots from that scene where Governor Tryon is dictating his response to this petition, and Murtaugh is reading it to his group of regulators. And what was really, really powerful about this scene, I really, if you haven't seen it, or if you haven't watched it in a while, go back and watch it, because those words that they're reading, they are from Governor Tryon's actual response that he wrote 251 years ago. Still holds up well. It's very well written. He's very clear in his language. Uses some great 18th century turns of phrase, and it's very dramatic. And it was really neat to see how the show was able to utilize some of those primary sources and some of those original things that were written at the time. This is going further back from Sautier's map. In the lower right-hand corner, you can see where Tryon's camp is. On the morning of May 16th, he marches his militia 5 miles to what is now Alamance Battleground State Historic Site, and there is this standoff between the militia and the regulators. Governor Tryon has his response read to the regulators, and the response is battle, battle, or fire and be damned. You also have regulators that open up their shirts and they bare their chests, sort of egging on the militia to go ahead and attack. And how is this shown in the TV series? Well, again, you've got your redcoats. You do have artillery in the center, which is exactly where Governor Tryon placed his guns at the battle to sort of bolster his main line. And then over on the right hand there on what would be Governor Tryon's left flank, you've got this civilian militia. I will say this is an improvement over how the Battle of Alamance has been depicted in the past by having some people in civilian clothes. But really, in reality, if you had been there on May 16th, 1771, you would have seen just a large group of people in their own clothes. And they would have been not quite arrayed out and like splayed out in a big blob the way you see there. It was actually very important to maintain, shoulder to shoulder, straight lines. And there were a front rank and a rear rank that were utilized at the Battle of Alamance. And here's another close-up of Sautier's map that shows the battle about to happen, this third position, the action. You can see that the two sides each kind of had their own hillside that they were on. What you can see with those kind of long swooping lines is an attempt at topography. So you've got two hillsides that each side is using. So both are sort of camped on positions of strength. And if you look at you see these little squiggly lines all throughout the map. Those are we think are meant to be trees. This is in an area that was not really well developed. There's not a lot of improved acreage. So it would have been mostly wooded. And you'll note that that's a little bit different from what they show in the TV series. Of course, it's kind of difficult to film a lot in the woods and kind of show off all of the extras that you're able to get. So you want a nice unbroken shot when you're doing that kind of film work. So the battle commences. What the Outlander TV series shows is a first phase that's in the open field, and then they go into the woods. And there's a lot of, like World War II style, get down low on the ground, fire and maneuver kind of stuff. And the part about that is probably most accurate is the way that they show the landscape. Because it was fairly wooded, it's actually a little bit more accurate than what Alamance Battleground even looks like now. But beyond that, the combat is kind of weird, but not unheard of for a Hollywood production, especially for 18th century military tactics. Once the battle is over, though, there are lots and lots of people who have been killed and wounded. On the militia side, there are 9 killed, 60 wounded, and there are only estimates for how many regulators are casualties as a result of this, and they settle on 200 to 300 people as a result of this action, which for the 18th century, for a battle between two groups of North Carolinians, it's a pretty big deal. Governor Tryon goes through this area, through what is the backcountry. What you're looking at is the area between Hillsborough, Salisbury, and Winston-Salem. That's the heart of Regulator country. Tryon marches right through, taking oaths of allegiance and capturing the ringleaders. Couple things I want to note before I wrap up here. With regard to the red coat, it's not correct. There's no, it would have been impossible to give North Carolina militia red coats. Those kind of regimental coats are insanely expensive, and this militia is only in the field for a couple of months. It just wouldn't make sense. But the way that the show depicts the Battle of Alamance is very much in keeping with the historical memory of the Battle of Alamance. And that's because the red coat is so evocative. And if you want to find a symbol of the bad guy, there's really no better thing that you can use. And I wanted to note one interesting thing with the show around the red coat. While Jamie would not have worn a red coat at the Battle of Alamance, I did appreciate what they did. The whole reason why they put him in the red coat was to pay off this moment at the end of the episode when he's just fed up, he's done, and he takes off the coat and he throws it at Governor Tryon's feet. And I started thinking about it after watching this episode, and I thought, you know, what he did, if you think of this red coat as something that is more symbolic, being, you know, vesting yourself in loyalty to the crown, that is something that North Carolinians did during this battle and during this campaign against the Regulators. These portraits that you see on the left hand of the slide, these are three prominent North Carolinians: Samuel Johnston, Richard Caswell, William Hooper. Samuel Johnston wrote the piece of legislation that the militia used to justify deadly force against the Regulators. Richard Caswell led his county militia at the Battle of Alamance, and William Hooper was one of those people that was beaten up in the riot in Hillsborough. All of them were more or less loyal to Governor Tryon and supported the militia expedition. All of them became prominent officials in North Carolina during the Revolutionary War. And of course, William Hooper is one of our signers of the Declaration of Independence. So where you were politically in 1771 did not guarantee where you were going to be in 1775 and 1776. And so they all proverbially put on the red coat, but then take it off 5 years later, or 4 years later in this case. And I want to share one last portion. This is from the books. And this was something that has really spoken to me. And it's a little departure from where the TV series went. This is from just before the battle starts. Roger and Jamie have gone off, and Bree is back in camp, obviously very nervous, not knowing what's going to happen. And Bree starts kind of talking to herself. And she says, "It's not in the history books. I read about the Boston Massacre. I saw it there in the history books, and I saw it here in the newspaper, but I never saw this there. I never read a word about Governor Tryon or North Carolina or a place called Alamance. So nothing's going to happen." She spoke fiercely, willing it. If there was a big battle here, someone would have written something about it. Nobody did, so nothing's going to happen. Nothing. And that really spoke to me, because a lot of people who come to Alamance Battleground have no idea what actually happened at our site. They have not heard about it. Maybe they heard about it in fourth grade history class, but by and large, it is a largely unsung historical moment. And just because we have not heard about it does not mean that it didn't happen or that it wasn't, you know, immensely significant at the time that it happened. And that's true of a lot of the things that we've talked about. You know, all of the documents that are in the state archives, they are instrumental in helping shed light on these, you know, historical moments and these unsung moments in North Carolina history and national history that, you know, we can use to learn more about, you know, our story together as North Carolinians and as Americans. So if you're interested in hearing a little bit more about the Battle of Alamance, I would invite you to come to our site on May 14th, 251st anniversary of the battle. We're going to have a living history program, and in the evening, a battlefield illumination where we'll have luminaries on the site marking where the Regulators stood, where the militia stood, and each luminary represents one of the people killed or wounded at the Battle of Alamance. So I hope to see you there in May. Thank you so much for listening.
All right, thank you. I've learned a lot, and I'm more interested in tackling some of the books. I've seen a little of the show, so this has been great. We do have a few questions, and I'll start out with one about religion, because I know that is some of our newer research, not mine, but some of the experts will be drawing on for next month's program about the role religion played in the sides people took. And so just wanted to throw that out to the panel. Some of you all have taken a stab at answering it in the chat already. In giving land grants, did religion play a part in that, especially Catholicism? Because as we've mentioned, as some of you have mentioned in the chat, we know of other denominations, other Protestant denominations, and there was a good deal of tolerance in North Carolina compared to some of the other colonies. But any notion about Catholicism?
The way that I describe it at Alamance Battleground, Catholic money is just as good as Anglican money, is just as good as Moravian money. The whole idea is to get people into the backcountry, start farming, form a tax base, and then that's going to benefit the crown. So it's like get farmers there any way that they can. And I'll give a reading recommendation. If you're interested in learning a little bit more about religion in the backcountry, check out a book by Marjolaine Carr's Breaking Loose Together. It's a history of the Regulator Movement, and a large portion of the book focuses on how the regulators almost to a person come from dissenting religious groups like Quakers, Baptists, Scottish New Light Presbyterians, German Pietists. You've got all these people who are willing to upset the established order in religious terms, and how their religious views kind of shape their political advocacy.
I think we would agree with that as well. Immigration was the big priority, and I don't really think that any kind of religious affiliation had any priority over the other as far as the colonial government was concerned at that time. Governor Tryon in the Outlander books kind of wink, wink, hint, hint to Jamie when he's offering them the land grant for the Fraser's Ridge settlement. And, Jamie brings up the fact of Catholicism, and Governor Tryon says, well, yeah, but, and you kind of get the idea that it's not that important really to him. The settling of the backcountry is more important. So I would agree with that.
There is one other thing.
Go ahead.
So I'm sorry. There is a 1764 Vestry Act, which is a tax that everybody in North Carolina pays to support the Anglican Church, regardless of whether you're an Anglican or not. So that's sort of how they protect, the hegemony of the Anglican Church. And it's one of those kind of forerunners to the Regulator Movement. It obviously upsets a lot of these dissenting groups. It was interesting to me to see some of the earlier regulator petitions say that they wanted to be able to get married in their own style. Yeah, that's one of their one of the things that they say needs to change.
Okay, so the point about money ties into another question, brings us to the present day. Are there any financial benefits to either of your sites? I think the question was specifically about Tryon Palace outside of the special tours for having your sites part of the setting in the series.
Alas, no. It's only the visitorship that's generated by people's interest. We'd hoped for a while that maybe they would film here, but a couple of years ago that became pretty clear that they were going to prioritize keeping their Scottish film crews over traveling to different film locations. So, I think that's a good reason for that. So, but no, we see no financial return other than tours, special tours.
We've seen a boost in visitation. A week doesn't go by where we don't hear from somebody who knows about us because of Outlander, and that leads to increased gift shop sales. I will say that Diana Gabaldon was very generous with her time when she came to North Carolina, and we did a couple fundraisers around that, and not to put too fine a point on it, but I think it like doubled the amount of like funds that our support group had available to them. It was a major boon.
I'll point out, we're not a site, but Secretary Wilson, we're all part of DNCR, Department of Natural and Cultural Resources, and our Secretary Wilson, is happy to point out that our department is the department of stuff people like about North Carolina. So we are not, I mean, obviously we would want to have financial benefits are always a good thing, but none of us are working for profit. We're working to preserve the history and prepare it for you and for anyone else who's interested. And thankfully there is budget set aside for us in the General Assembly. Generosity is always fantastic, but our main goal is to get more people interested in the history, get more people to the sites, to the collections. And I think so Outlander's been very successful for us in that way and is driving our mission in that respect.
Mhm.
Okay, and then we have one more question about Governor Tryon's military experience prior to Alamance.
He held a commission in the 1st Regiment of Foot Guards, which is sort of an elite unit in the British Army. And he did see action in France during the 7 Years' War, and was wounded in that action as well. I've spoken with, modern military and a few Army officers who have looked over his orderly book from the expedition against the Regulators, and they have noted that he definitely had a good military mind, and that's actually something that he is criticized for by North Carolinians after this all ends up, that he was looking for a military solution to what was a political problem.
Yeah. He his library, one of the largest sections of his library is military work. So for what he didn't like, for what battlefield experience he didn't have, he certainly had made up for that in reading and military theory.
And it's interesting, he commissioned Sauthier right at the time, right? Wasn't that map produced either just before or just after the battle?
Brought in, yes, the cartographer for that purpose.
So
Yes.
was it part of the battle plan, or was it documenting the battle
I
afterwards?
don't believe it was part of the battle plan, but it was definitely, as we saw, really good map of the events as they happen. But I don't believe it was a battle plan.
But as Lindy pointed out, Tryon doesn't stick around North Carolina very long after the Battle of Alamance. He is transferred to New York, and then we have Governor Martin, and that's why, and Lindy, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's why Tryon Palace interprets the Martin family, because they actually lived in Tryon Palace much longer than Tryon did.
We're trying to do more with bringing in the Martins, but traditionally, when they built the palace, it was they were just interested in Tryon. And in fact, one of our staff jokes that like you weren't even allowed to mention the Martins. It was, forbidden to mention the Martins. But we're trying to bring them in because they're a young family, and there's, I think, a lot of things that people today would identify with in that. And then even in Martin himself, like, he's a young man and he's struggling in his career. And I think most millennials of a certain age identify with that, trying to establish yourself in a career. So hopefully we'll kind of build out a more robust telling of their story, along with, the other members of their household in the coming years.
They had a much more interesting departure than William Tryon did.
That's true. Yes. A little bit more exciting.
All right. Well, we've kept our audience till the red times, till my bedtime, I think. So it's time to wrap it up. But all of our panelists are happy to answer questions and hear from you all with questions you think of later. And we appreciate everyone's participation tonight. Thank you so much.
We'll see you in New Bern, Raleigh, and Alamance.
Yes.
There you go. Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Good evening.
Good night.
Good night.